Welcome to 2018, everyone. 2018 has already been full of surprises and it's only a few days old. Anyway, you'll find out about that in the next couple of videos. But I've had a few comments from people and they've asked, why have you neglected the Winchester 1895? And I have neglected the 1895, no doubt about it. And so I thought, well, the first video of 2018 is going to be about an amazing lever action. And for those of you who know the 1895, it's self-evident, even before I identify it, it is without a doubt the most unique lever action rifle ever made. And why is it unique? So in front here we have typical 1894 Winchester, which I went over in another video. I wish I had a Winchester 1892 and a Winchester 1886 in front of me, but I don't. I'm assuming some of you will know those models, and if you don't, you can check on YouTube. But getting back to the 1895, obviously this is not an original Winchester product. This is a reproduction made in Japan, and it's in caliber 270. Now, some people have scolded me for liking this rifle in caliber 270 Winchester, which I think, along with many other people on earth, is one of the finest cartridges there is. And they've scolded me because they say it should be in a traditional cartridge, and these came out in cartridges like 30-40 Craig and 30-06. They'll be marked 30 government and so on. And then of course the massive 405 Winchester. And I'm sure some of you are collectors out there, and I owned the 405 Winchester. Same thing, more similar to the 405 owned by Theodore Roosevelt, the fine president. And the recoil is significant, there's no doubt about it, in the 405. And I sold my 405s, I sold the 30-40 Craigs, I sold everything. But partly because I have visitors and people see my guns and they just want to own them, and I always think, well, I have the pipeline, so I'll probably come across another someday. Keeps life interesting and exciting. So I kept the 270s because somehow people thought this is the wrong cartridge for a traditional or semi-traditional Jonathan Browning lever action rifle. But I'll get back to what I wanted to tell you about. So you may remember we looked at how the 1894 locks, and the lock is right there, and I've promised my cameraman not to be too quick. So you can see the lock rising like a falling block, and the bullet can't move because it's trapped by the receiver and now by the lock. This is 30-30 Winchester. The pressures you can look up, they're quite mild. This was supposed to be kind of a new generation of lever action rifle. And when you're talking about the 30-06, the pressures are entirely different. The technical problems are several. First of all, the 30-06 is much longer than a 30-30 or a 32 Winchester or a 38-55. Those last cartridges I just listed off are only some of the chamberings for the original 1894. So you have a longer cartridge, you have a cartridge with a lot more pressure, and the most important problem is that you have a cartridge which uses Spitzer bullets. That's a German word, and Spitzer bullets are pointed bullets, and of course the trajectory of a pointed projectile is far superior to the trajectory of a rounded projectile, and I don't think I need to explain why that's so. However, you can't put pointed projectiles in a tubular magazine, one after another. The point of the cartridge, and most of you know this, will be resting on the primer of the cartridge in front. So on recoil, theoretically, the pointed bullet of this cartridge will hit the primer of this one, which will hit the primer of this one, and so on. Now, I've heard that since I was a kid. And I've seen tests where people actually arrange it so that the pointed bullets are on the primers of the cartridges in front. And fortunately, it's not as much of a disaster as one would think, but nevertheless, it does happen that the pointed bullet of the cartridge here acts like a firing pin, and this cartridge in front fires. I hope you followed all that and I didn't confuse you. Obviously, if you're after military contracts, which was part of the theory of the 1895, you can't have any possibility for error. We all know what mil-spec means. So that means we need a box magazine, and here it is. And I wanted to draw to your attention something. Have a look at these receivers. Some of the people that have written me describe the 1895 as a behemoth, a massive, like overwhelming action. And it is a bigger action, like it's longer because the cartridge that it needs to accommodate is longer. But I thought I should put an 1894 on the table. And I don't generally like arguing with people. I think that the truth is most of the time self-evident. This is not some kind of like abnormally large action. I actually will try to place one on top of the other. And you can see the 1894 is smaller and the 1895 is bigger. But especially if you get rid of the box magazine, which is why I have this white piece of paper. The box magazine is what makes the 1895 look like a colossal action. I didn't measure, but I'm not even sure that it isn't more slender than the 1894. But these are things that collectors and gun people look at, and what's the significance, I'm not sure. But I just wanted to point out that this is not a monstrosity. This is a mechanism designed obviously by an extremely intelligent person, and to overcome technical problems which probably should be overcome by an entirely new mechanism, but Jonathan Browning decided to adapt what he knew. So we pointed out the locking lug on the 1894. On the 1895, this is going to be hard, and I'm sorry about my poor production quality. You'll see that, take a look here. See these? Don't they remind you of the locking lugs on the 1892 or the 1886? Except they're in the 1892, and 1886, they rise on the side of the action, and on those actions, you can see them clearly rising here and here. On the 1895, he did everything possible to create strength in the action. So we have both rising blocks on the sides as well as the locking at the back. So this bolt is completely trapped. I have measured the headspace on many old 1895s, and I can tell you that the headspace is not good. The action obviously has stretched somewhat, and that's because of the 30-06 cartridge pressures. But I've never seen one come undone, and I've never heard of any accidents, which means they held, which is all that matters. I guess the Russians ordered a whole whack of these in 7.62 by 54R, and that's another story. That's a rimmed cartridge. A rimmed cartridge is a good idea for the Jonathan Browning type lever actions because of how they eject. You can see the extractor and ejector here, and I'll try to slow down so that my cameraman can accommodate my words. So here's the extractor, and then the rounds eject out the top. And now I'll set this one down, and you can see that the 1894 is the same concept. So getting back to my original point, the rimmed cartridges give this extractor a little bit more of something to grip onto. Now I'm going to draw your attention to how the 1894 works without going into details. You can see the bottom falls out of the action. And I discussed in another video the mechanical advantages of this design compared to the Marlin and others which have a lump here on the bottom. You can look if you don't believe me. which is why the 1894 remains probably the most handy rifle that you can buy. And you know I'm a fan of this rifle. But getting back now to 1895, take a look at what Jonathan Browning had to do in order to cause this motion, let's call it horizontal motion, for the very long 30-06 with a box magazine underneath in an action that locks both on the sides by way of these lugs, which are on both sides, as well as the block at the back. And I wish I had light to paint this with. And by the way, I'm going to try to improve my production quality. I apologize, and all your comments, even the harsh ones, are welcome. I know how bad my videos are. The sound is probably no good. There's probably too much shaking and all the rest of that stuff. I know. I just haven't had the time to overcome these things because that's not my area of specialization. Anyhow, quite an exciting firearm. So box magazine, how do you load this thing? You load it through the top. And some of you may not be aware, I've seen people at the range and they're trying to stuff cartridges in here horizontally. That can be done, but it's easier if you actually load them vertically and then tip them down one after another. They just kind of fall down, and I do believe that's how it was intended to be loaded. So then, assuming that I just finished pushing the follower down and put in whatever it is, 5 rounds, I'm not sure. We close the action. This all folds up, and you know how Jonathan Browning loved things that do one thing in one position and several things in another position. And people criticize this gun wrongly. They said, we don't like the 1885, the guts fall out of the bottom of the action. Well, yes and no. Parts have to go someplace, and so he put a pivot point here. The trigger is obviously not a fixed trigger, but it all folds up back into the action, and once it's in place, everything makes sense once again. So we now have a cartridge theoretically in the chamber. We have more cartridges here. We fire, and now we have brass, and I'm just going to repeat the operating cycle for you. For those of you that aren't familiar, we have a nice latch to retain the lever. We have a wonderful release. We have a split lever in the back, which accomplishes release of the lever. Now, as the critic said, the guts fall out. The action opens, the brass case is ejected, and another round is waiting to be fed back into the chamber. And then once again, the locking lugs rise and the action is locked. And this is a 270, and 270, as you know, is not a pipsqueak of a cartridge. Actually, in a lot of ways, the 270 does everything that a centerfire cartridge needs to do, with the 130 grain bullet in particular. If you doubt me, and especially some of the younger viewers, you could punch in Jack O'Connor and read about the 270 Winchester cartridge, which is a neck down 30-06. And a lot of my viewers know more about guns than I do, but I have to speak to the whole audience. So those of you who are just starting out in guns, have a look at that 270. It was an amazing cartridge in its time, and it remains amazing today. Getting back to the action dimensions, so this way, it's not that big. I have to agree, this way, it's a wider action, and I'll show you the model 94. So this is a thinner action, and as you know, I've said a few times, this is the most balanced, probably most perfect sporting arm. It's not strong like a Mauser, but it doesn't have to be because of the cartridge it's designed for. It has the tubular magazine. Those features were perfected here. In 1895, we had an entirely new and different ball game. And so why do I still have this 270? As I explained, I think it's a fantastic cartridge. This Morocco product is just beautifully made. The ones I had in 405 usually had no excess headspace, and if you're not familiar with what excess headspace means, rather than for me to give another speech, you can check on that or write me and I'll be happy to write you back. It has kind of a tang safety. I mean, what do you do in this day and age? You have to have some kind of a safety or something's going to go wrong and then somebody's going to end up in court. So that's just what it is. And the stock is close to the original. I mean, everything about the rifle I think is appealing. And I guess the one potential weakness for people that like scopes, it's a little tricky to put a scope on this, but actually I've seen a clever gentleman who had the bolt, not that I'm recommending this, but he had it drilled and tapped and he put a scope on top right here that moved with the bolt. The bolt moved back with the scope, and of course he had to move his head because the scope would have hit his eye, but it doesn't matter. And then when he closed the action, the scope wasn't in place. And it kind of, people would say, maybe it didn't look good. I thought it looked okay myself. And other people would say the bolt is not rigid enough and there's some play in the scope. Not true. Were not true in that particular case. The rifle was extremely accurate, but these are extremely accurate anyway. So for everybody that said, what do you have to say about the 1895? Obviously, I have to say it's an A triple plus, amazing firearm. It's an adaptation of a mechanism that was designed for shorter cartridges with less pressure, but in the mind of that genius, he was able to accommodate a far different round and successfully. And like I said, he had those Russian contracts, and I'm not aware of any other significant nations, shouldn't put it that way, but I can always be wrong, adopting the 1895. Maybe somebody did. Anyway, the fact that it's here as a reproduction means that it's worth reproducing. People missed these when they were out of production, and that headspace issue meant sometimes maybe it's better to get something brand new. So here I have the 270, and that is about it. I hope I've done it justice to this remarkable firearm. And with the 270, I have to say I like it because there's almost no recoil. So there it is. If I've missed something, I apologize in advance. I'm sure I have. And for all of you people that know tons more than I do, at least I make an effort to show people who somehow find my channel some really amazing parts of American history, which I think most of the time involve firearms. So that's about it. Thanks for watching.